After the 1960s, Nixon, a Republican president, was elected in 1969 in hopes to bring his nation together. He tried to live up to people's expectations by forming diplomatic relations with several countries. However, instead he disheartened his people with his imperial presidency. His involvement in the Vietnam War and Cambodia entrapped him in several problems with the United States government. His focus on foreign affairs brought him in conflicts with the strict Democratic Congress. On top of that, the Supreme Court has always been hesitant with limits associated to the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees the freedom of speech and press to all citizens.
However, in 1971, the Supreme Court was faced with this issue once again with the New York Times. This newspaper gained access to confidential documents known as the Pentagon Papers. This Defense Department report highlighted the government's scheme in the Vietnam War. The Pentagon Papers came upon the American people in a time where they were deeply divided, and any sort of U.S. involvement would endanger the country severely. These papers were obtained by the New York Times and Washington Post. These confidential documents were copied and illegally leaked to the press.
The June 13, 1971 issue of the New York Times had Neil Sheehan's first story on the Pentagon Papers, which was titled, "Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement." On Monday evening, June 14th, Attorney General John Mitchell warned the Times against further publication. The next day, on June 15th, the United States Court issued an injunction or a restraining order against the Times because these papers were a threat to the country's national security. This injunction was also extended to the Washington Post. The New York Times appealed the order and argued that this order simply violated their freedom of speech and press guaranteed in the First Amendment. New York Times versus the United States was a fight between natural rights and the national security of a nation. The decision of this court case would decide which matter was more important to the United States Supreme Court.
In 1969, Daniel Ellsberg got access to the Pentagon Papers and released copies of the top-secret history of the Vietnam War. Many Americans responded with resentment and labeled Ellsberg as a traitor to the country. Ellsberg opposed the war, ergo him and Anthony Russo decided to photocopy the study so they could disclose it. When they got access to these papers, they approached Nixon and his administration, who turned a blind eye. Then, in 1971, Ellsberg offered this study to a New York Times reporter, Neil Sheehan, who published articles in the June issue in 1971. These papers revealed that the U.S. had increased war effort by bombing Cambodia and Laos, which frightened the Americans of further war involvement. On June 13, 1971, Neil Sheehan published his first story of the Pentagon Papers, which was titled Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement. After reading this, on June 14th, Attorney General John Mitchell warned the Times against further publication, and the next day, the U.S. court issued an injunction, or a restraining order against the Times because these papers were a threat to the country's national security. However, the New York Times argued that this order violated their freedom of speech and press guaranteed in the First Amendment. They stated that Article 1, Section 6 of the United States Constitution provided that for any speech or debate in either house, and a senator or a representative shall not be questioned in any other place. Ellsberg said the documents demonstrated unconstitutional behavior by a succession of presidents and the violation of the oath of every one of their subordinates. Ellsberg admitted that he leaked the papers to end what he perceived to be a wrongful war. This court case entrapped Nixon in further complications with the U.S. government and its people.
Adding even more fuel to the fire during his second campaign for president, Nixon's engagement in an affair known as the Watergate scandal would eventually lead to his resignation. During the campaign, the Democratic Party was planning to block the re-election of Nixon, so he wanted to ensure that this did not happen. Nixon advised a group known as the Plumbers to plug the leaks or stop the leaking of confidential information, such as the Pentagon Papers.
In June 1972, 5 men bugged the Democratic National Committee's offices in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. These men included E. Howard Hunt, Jr. and G. Gordon Liddy. Although Nixon knew nothing of the Plumbers' plans, his action to try and cover up this incident hinted otherwise. Despite Nixon's efforts to mask this incident, in 1973, a Senate committee began an investigation in which this Watergate scandal, along with several other legal actions, were revealed.
It was discovered that Nixon had installed a taping system that recorded his conversations with advisors. When Nixon reluctantly released the tapes, the missing film further indicated that his presidency was full of scandals.
After the Pentagon Papers incident, I do not want any more slip-ups. These leaks must be patched up. Do not disappoint me.
Why don't we listen into the phones and meetings of the Democratic Party?
Yes, good idea.
We need to know our opponent and hinder their campaign against Nixon.
When the Democratic Party meets in June at the Watergate Towers, we will be listening in.
Yes! We can bug the room.
But wait! Wiretapping is such a dangerous venture. We must be quick. Our actions have to be undercover. Yes! Let's go, guys.
I hired you men to cover up leaks, not create them. If the press gets wind of this, it will ruin me. When asked, you shall remain silent about this affair. The last thing I need is a scandal. If the media finds out, I will lose to those wretched Democrats.
Nixon did not know the plumber's plan until after it happened. His order of covering up his scandal is where the true problems arose. The cover-up operation was a crime under federal law.
The Senate set up a committee to look into illegal, improper, or unethical activities in the 1972 election.
In 1973, when the Senate committee began the investigation, several other illegal actions were revealed as well. It was discovered that Nixon had installed a taping system that recorded his conversations with advisors. When Nixon reluctantly released the tapes, the missing film further indicated that his presidency was full of scandals.
Right, yeah.
Now we hope you will participate in our reenactment of the 1974 court case, United States versus Nixon. This is the case in which Nixon's impeachment charges were brought up but never actually enforced as a result of his decision to resign.